the most lightened new God, the most lightened new gods, a most lightened new God, the most lightened new goddess, the most lightened new goddesses, a most lightened new goddess, the most lightened old God, the most lightened old gods, a most lightened old God, the most lightened old goddess, the most lightened old goddesses, a most lightened old goddess, the most lightened greater God, the most lightened greater gods, a most lightened greater God, the most lightened greater goddess, the most lightened greater goddesses, a most lightened greater goddess, the most lightened lesser God, the most lightened lesser gods, a most lightened lesser God, the most lightened lesser goddess, the most lightened lesser goddesses, a most lightened lesser goddess, the most lightened greater spirit, the most lightened greater spirits, a most lightened greater spirit, the most lightened lesser spirit, the most lightened lesser spirits, a most lightened lesser spirit, the most lightened major God, the most lightened major gods, a most lightened major God, the most lightened major goddess, the most lightened major goddesses, a most lightened major goddess, the most lightened minor God, the most lightened minor gods, a most lightened minor God, the most lightened minor goddess, the most lightened minor goddesses, a most lightened minor goddess, the most lightened superior God, the most lightened superior gods, a most lightened superior God, the most lightened superior goddess, the most lightened superior goddesses, a most lightened superior goddess, the most lightened inferior God, the most lightened inferior gods, a most lightened inferior God, the most lightened inferior goddess, the most lightened inferior goddesses, a most lightened inferior goddess, the most lightened ancestor God, the most lightened ancestor gods, a most lightened ancestor God, the most lightened ancestor goddess, the most lightened ancestor goddesses, a most lightened ancestor goddess, the most lightened descendant God, the most lightened descendant gods, a most lightened descendant God, the most lightened descendant goddess, the most lightened descendant goddesses, a most lightened descendant goddess, the most lightened descendant God, the most lightened descendant gods, a most lightened descendant God, the most lightened descendant goddess, the most lightened descendant goddesses, a most lightened descendant goddess, the most lightened transcendent God, the most lightened transcendent gods, a most lightened transcendent God, the most lightened transcendent goddess, the most lightened transcendent goddesses, a most lightened transcendent goddess, the most lightened future God, the most lightened future gods, a most lightened future God, the most lightened future goddess, the most lightened future goddesses, a most lightened future goddess, the most lightened present God, the most lightened present gods, a most lightened present God, the most lightened present goddess, the most lightened present goddesses, a most lightened present goddess, the most lightened past God, the most lightened past gods, a most lightened past God, the most lightened past goddess, the most lightened past goddesses, a most lightened past goddess, the most lightened God, the most lightened gods, a most lightened God, the most lightened goddess, the most lightened goddesses, a most lightened goddess, the most lightened half God, the most lightened half gods, a most lightened half God, the most lightened half goddess, the most lightened half goddesses, a most lightened half goddess, the most lightened vessel, the most lightened vessels, a most lightened vessel, the most lightened person, the most lightened persons, a most lightened person, the most lightened image, the most lightened images, a most lightened image, the most lightened belief, the most lightened beliefs, a most lightened belief, the most lightened thought, the most lightened thoughts, a most lightened thought, the most lightened word, the most lightened words, a most lightened word, the most lightened action, the most lightened actions, a most lightened action, the most lightened situation, the most lightened situations, a most lightened situation, the most lightened circumstance, the most lightened circumstances, a most lightened circumstance, the most lightened relationship, the most lightened relationships, a most lightened relationship, the most lightened number, the most lightened numbers, a most lightened number, the most lightened formula, the most lightened formulas, a most lightened formula, the most lightened symbol, the most lightened symbols, a most lightened symbol, the most lightened color, the most lightened colors, a most lightened color, the most lightened thing, the most lightened things, a most lightened thing, the most lightened way, the most lightened ways, a most lightened way, the most lightened place, the most lightened places, a most lightened place, the most lightened time, the most lightened times, a most lightened time, the most lightened event, the most lightened events, a most lightened event, the most lightened result, the most lightened results, a most lightened result,